So you have to be a student. And they said, well, student to be alive.
Yeah.
And they said, no, just to enroll. So I'm
So it's the student housing.
student.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Nice.
yeah. So he has two friends that are, well, he has a lot of friends that go to U of I. Two friends that are going to U of I and he's going to
Objection.
I'm a U of I alum.
Oh, you
Yeah. And met my wife there. And I met in '93.
It's a great school.
Yeah.
He just has a little
we go.
situation.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning, Mike One.
Good morning, Mike on TV. We're humanities and literary arts organization, not so much. Okay, thanks, Tech Truck. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day number 2 of Winter Fishtrap. My name is Mike Midlow, and we're super happy to have you here. Since 1998, Fishtrap has hosted a Winter Fishtrap program to explore themes that are important to folks in the West. This year's theme is, what is the West? You all got a program which has great bios on all of our speakers, all of our presenters. It's an all-star cast. I'm pretty proud of what we put together this weekend and proud of you for coming. It's pretty cool. But also, if you look on page 2, for those of you who weren't here last night, there's a nifty map of North America. Before we even get started with these conversations, go ahead and circle what you think is the West. What your perception of it is coming into the program. There's some questions there to think about. And then as the weekend and these conversations continue, is that perception bolstered? Is it confirmed? Or maybe are you thinking of the West in a different way through these different conversations? So we want this to be interactive. The more programs we do at Fishtrap, the more all of us are thinking about them not being lectures, not being talked to, but having conversations, and everybody has a voice in these conversations. We're super happy to have you here. I just want to mention a couple things before we get going, because without our program partners, Wallowa Resources and the Wallowa Land Trust, this just wouldn't have happened. So thanks to those organizations for putting together today's panels, and also all of our panelists and everybody who came. I do want to talk about, do I have our, I do. All the people who helped sponsor, help me out with this. The people who are sponsored and our other program partners are M. Crow, Winding Waters, Wallowa Resources, Good Groceries, Grain Growers, Eagle Cap Vacation Rentals, the Best Western up on the hill. Who else am I missing? There are a few others. Josephi Center, the Nez Perce Wallowa Homeland. It ends up being a community program where so many people. Those are my favorite thing. I didn't. And so those are my favorite things when we have these partnerships with other organizations in the county. It makes it be a community-wide kind of program, and that's what we like to do. So last night, Shannon got up and talked to us about how to have these conversations. If you weren't here, Shannon talked about what is a safe space, what is a brave space. And then Deborah Magpie Erling just came and got us started thinking about what is the West in different, and I'm gonna have to think about her talk for a while. As a matter of fact, I went home last night and my wife said, "How was Deborah's talk?" And I said, "I have to think about it for a while before I tell you what it was." So and maybe that happened to all you folks too. So when we started talking about this, I got a hold of Kathleen Ackley at Wallowa Land Trust. Said, "Hey, would you like to lead a conversation?" And so we came up with who owns the West, and that is a big question. And Kathleen did so much work to pull together this great panel. We have 3 people here in person. Lisa Collier, Jeff Fields, and Bobbie Conner. You can read their bios. And also we have somebody online, historian Adam Sowards, who will be participating via Zoom. So I just want to thank you all for being here, and I'm going to just toss it to Kathleen Ackley, and we're going to learn a little bit about who owns the West. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. I don't think, is this mic on? Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. I am really honored to share this stage with my fellows here and fellows up there via Zoom land. So how to answer that question, who owns the West? Well, I think that would depend upon what your definition of the word own is. Most people would likely say, well, the government, corporations, organizations, private individuals, and municipalities own the West. And in fact, if you were to do a quick Google search, who owns the West, you're going to pop up with a map with all of these amazing colors that demonstrate, who actually owns the West. I'll give you a hint. Under that definition, the Bureau of Land Management owns an awful lot of the West. But most definitions about land ownership center on the idea of a legal right to use and control and transfer a piece of land. So it's a concept of legal rights that an individual, organization, or government has over property. In almost every instance, the land is described as an inanimate thing, an object, to be dominated, controlled, consumed, transferred, basically used by people. And the land has obligations to us, but not vice versa. And personally, I find this view of land disheartening. We live in a world where the idea of ownership, owning things like stuff, cars, house, lands, that is central to our identity. I mean, how many of you have left the house without your cell phone and you feel naked? I don't know. I feel that way. I'm like, oh my God, I don't have my cell phone. What am I going to do? It's this thing I'm clinging to. And so I want to ask that question, like, who are we without these things that we own? How has the idea of owning things, especially owning land, made our communities better, stronger, more resilient, healthier? Or perhaps by defining land as an object to have, along with all the other things that we have, we make ourselves smaller, poorer, sicker, and bereft of meaning. So what if instead of the question, who owns the West, we asked, who's responsible for the West? Who cares for the West? Who depends on the West? Who is in relationship with the West? And perhaps you have an answer, or you have multiple answers. When I contemplate these questions, I consider that ownership of land is more than just a legal agreement or a legal document declaring that you have title. Regardless of whether you have a piece of paper that gives you title to a particular slice of dirt, we're all part of the story of the West. In my opinion, we all own the West in that we're all connected to it. The quality of our lives is directly proportionate to the quality of the land around us. Whether it's clean air, water, or the nutritious food that the soil produces, our lives depend on the land. But it's not just our lives, it's the lives of billions of other plants, animals, insects. What do you think? It's kind of the questions that we're exploring here today. And before we get too deep into it, I did want to share a quote by Robin Wall Kimmerer that I thought was relevant here. So here it is. Being naturalized to place means to live as if this is the land that feeds you, as if these are the streams from which you drink, that build your body and fill your spirit. To become naturalized is to know that your ancestors lie in this ground. Here you will give your gifts and meet your responsibilities. To become naturalized is to live as if your children's future matters, to take care of the land as if our lives and all the lives of all of our relatives depend on it, because they do. Now, what if you took that same quote and took out the word naturalized and instead said own land? When you own land or you have land ownership. To me, they're very similar. And I was inspired by that. So with those words setting the stage, I want to invite a conversation, first with our panelists and later with you as we go into breakouts. And I will be interjecting questions now and then. But why not start just by giving you, the panelists, a chance to share your thoughts on this topic, or give us some completely different thoughts, whatever, it's up to you. And because we do have Adam on Zoom, I want to be very aware that I want to invite him into the conversation. And actually, I think maybe Adam, if you don't mind, actually starting us off, and I'll hand it to you.
Great, thanks. I will have to rely on you if you can't hear me I can see you so you can wave at me if things aren't going well. Perfect. Thanks for letting me to zoom in. I tried to bring the Wallowas with me with my background from over a decade ago. My first trip there was a beautiful place. Sorry, I can't join you. So when I hear the question, who owns the West? I'm a historian. So one of the first things I think about is, well, when are we talking? And if you'll give me a few minutes to give a history lesson, because I can't help myself, I want to think about land in the United States and how the West fits with all of that. Early on, even before the Republic was formed, the idea of ownership of land was really central to what Americans were after. And there was a belief that in private land ownership, people could cultivate not only crops, but virtue. And virtue is necessary for the success of the Republic. It's a great idea. It overlooks all sorts of things like the theft of land, the theft of labor, that goes on and on throughout the continent. But much of early American policy was designed to get land that had been taken and put in individuals' hands. This was done most famously through the Homestead Act, of course, which seems to define the American West. But in fact, when the Homestead Act largely gets to the far West, where all of you are, where I am, it doesn't work because the West didn't work in that 160-acre nice, neat square. The West was dry. The West was mountainous. The West was very forested, and people couldn't make a living on land like that very well. So by the end of the 19th century, there was reconsideration about how that private ownership might work. And the federal government said, well, that works in a lot of places, but it won't work here and it won't work there. It won't work here because it's really pretty here and we want everyone to be able to go. So we set aside a place like Yellowstone. Or we look at a place that's very mountainous, like say the Wallowas. So that's not going to work because you can't make a living there on 160 acres. So gradually, around the turn of the 20th century and onward, the government reserves these places for the public. This is not going to be a place for individuals to own, but a place that the government will caretake. And the federal government does this sometimes well, sometimes not so well, depends on where and when. And that system evolves into our public land system in an important way that I think is one of the defining features of the West. I'm not sure this exactly answers the who owns the West question, but the maintenance of federal land owned by all the American people is quite distinct in this region. It shapes the politics, it shapes the geography, it shapes the economy. And I think that that's always something really important for us to keep in mind. And then the last piece, and then I'll yield some space back, is that by the time we get to the 1960s and 1970s, the laws that govern all of these different types of public lands, the parks, the refuges, the forests, the rangelands, become more uniform. That there are environmental laws such as the National Environmental Policy Act or the Endangered Species Act that tries to unite some of the policies and that puts in many ways greater restrictions on the federal government. And ownership always seems wrong to me in terms of federal ownership. I think a different term might be used. I'm not sure what that term would be: managed, controlled, governed. those rules that the federal government has to follow on those lands is different. And I think that's an important thing that's different from an individual land ownership perspective. I'll stop now, but I will certainly pop back in as the conversation goes forth.
Okay. Actually, Bobbie, I want to throw it to you next.
Thank you. Tatsmewi, good morning. Inawanikwas Sasawipam, that's my Indian name. Yesterday was a big day for Oregon statehood. February 14th, 1859 is the anniversary of its proclamation of statehood. Interestingly enough, when we talk about who owns the West, I suggest to you Oregon has an issue with the clouded title. The treaty dispossessing us of our lands was not ratified till March 8th of 1859 by Congress. So they were a little bit ahead of the game when they declared statehood here, and we'd be happy to take the land back. When we talk about the West, I'll first just jump back a little bit to a point that came up last night about what is the West, the definition of the West. And the indigenous West that I think about is the Indian territories. So the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the Northwest is the Ohio River territory, not us. And when I think about the work we do in Oregon with various organizations, I'm one of the people who immediately gets rankled when somebody suggests that Bend is in Eastern Oregon. And so for those of us who defend Eastern Oregon viciously and fiercely, we know where Eastern Oregon is. And we're in the easternmost part of Oregon right now. But when we talk about who owns the West, when I think about the legal title, the piece of paper, the deed, the conveyance possibility, the ability to transfer, I think about two things. One is much of the West is owned by the federal government. It's held in trust, as are the lands of Indian reservations. And we were wards of the government, and the trustee was our great white father. And the interesting thing about the government owning land is that they have the title, and we have the beneficial use. And those of us who have treaties that allow us to hunt, fish, gather, dig, pick, graze livestock on open and unclaimed lands or public lands, think about that beneficial use a lot because it doesn't get exercised as often as we'd like to. But more importantly to me, when I think about ownership, what ownership has meant in the United States and pretty much around the rest of the world is who we can exclude. The definition of ownership is the right to exclude people. And that's what we have done. We did that here in Wallowa County in 1877. We excluded the people whose homeland this is. And so with possessory rights, we have the arrogance and the ego and the wherewithal in legal Western property law definitions to tell people who cannot be here. And for me, that's the enormous challenge about ownership, because it has a really ugly history in this country and many countries around the world. The history of dispossession is the history of the United States. They are inalienable from each other.
I don't know, Jeff or Lisa, Lisa, I was almost inclined to go to you next, considering your role as a public servant and your thoughts on it.
Sure. For those of you who I have not met yet, my name is Lisa Collier. I do have the role as Wallowa County Commissioner, but anything I say here today is just me. So don't make me come find you and have another conversation about the commissioners say no. So thank you for having me, first off. And I'm going to go backwards and say, when I leave the house without earrings, it makes me feel naked, not my cell phone.
Yeah,
I don't know why, but that's my thing that I just hold on to. So the land, Wallowa County specifically is about 68% publicly owned, or owned by federal, state agencies, partnerships. So ownership of land in its legal sense is something, but what I want to talk about is everything else. You know, do you have to own land to breathe the air? Do you have to own land to go enjoy the forest? Do you have to own land? And that answer is no. I think that, to me, in a sense of who owns the West, well, what is the West? And it's a lot of things. I think it can be culture, it's history, it's air, it's beautiful views, it's people. And I think we all do. And to our panelist that's online, it's also when are we talking about? They owned it, we own it, they will own it. You know, it's transferable in that way of the people that are here, and it's our responsibility to take care of it and be good stewards of it. Just jokingly, I was recently traveling with a Union County commissioner, and we were on the other side of the state. And when we came into Union County, I really didn't know what he was doing, but he just like pumped the brakes and rolled down the window and went, "Oh, that's good." And I said, "Oh, you just wait 60 more miles and it gets better." You know, like, and I just think that, you know, there's something about hitting that Wallowa County line and just going, "Oh, I'm home. This place is so special and it's so important." And I love it. I know you love it. The air is clean. The land is beautiful. And, you know, as beautiful is all of our relationships. I love people. People are good. It's our responsibility. We own it. We own this place. Whether we actually legally own land or not, we're all here. And so it's our job. So deeper into that later, but that's my answer for now.
Awesome. I'm going to hand it over to you, Mr. Fields.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Nice to see a crowd this morning, and nice to share the stage or share the riser here with all of you. Gosh, I mean, we've so far in the conversation, the concepts of legal ownership and right to exclude, and that's been fairly prominent. And I guess, as a way to sort of kick off this conversation, I want to bring into the conversation the idea of split estate, and just to kind of get us on the same page as when we talk about who owns. I mean, it depends whether you're talking about the surface of the land, or the water that flows across the land, or the minerals buried within the land, or the air above it, the aquifer, the ancient waters. It matters what the predominant land use is. If you think even within the private landowning sphere, our private forest landowners are subject to much greater regulation and restriction than our private rangeland owners in terms of what they can and can't do. Let alone when you start talking tribal trust lands versus public managed lands versus private managed lands. So I just wanted to introduce some of those concepts, and then quickly sort of pivot to one thing Bobbie spoke to with respect to, and I think Kathleen spoke to it too at her opening comments, the idea of a legal right to the land. And it, of course, we have to question or ask the question, what law, and is that law just? And because as we know, legal and just are not synonymous, right? And in fact, one of my colleagues some months ago shared with me a book titled "In the Courts of the Conqueror, the 10 Worst Indian Law Cases Ever Decided." It's a bit of a heavy tome, but there's a lot in there. I'd recommend that one. It's a short book.
It's too small.
Just the 10 worst, you know, there's they had to draw a line somewhere. And that book definitely emphasizes the fact that just because and as you read through the different cases, you see the mental gymnastics and gyrations that the judges went through to get to their legal conclusions, and how unjust those decisions were. And then I think I just would sort of close my opening with a reflection back to something that Deborah Magpie Erling said last night, which was that stories don't have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that was a little light bulb going on. And I think land ownership, same thing. We are here on this continuum. So I don't know, here we are. Back to you, Kathleen.
I have a lot of thoughts. Thank you so much for the responses. It definitely it's like you can prepare ahead of time and have some questions, but then it's like, no, wait, now once you've said that, I'm thinking about something else. Considering that we are constrained by the legal parameters of what it means to technically own land. I mean, we do sit in that legal state. How do we as a community move more into relationship? Or even if we cannot change who legally owns the land per se, what are the things that we can do as a community to increase our connection, to be better stewards, to share and to not exclude people? Those are, and also thinking about the non-human inhabitants, like how do we include them in our decision making? And so those are the kind of things that I think about, particularly when, Lisa, you talked about this love of place. You come back to Wallowa County, you want to unroll the window and go snort that air. It's like, there is that feeling of, to me, that's like an embrace of the land caring for me or for us and welcoming us. So how do we then reciprocate with our own welcoming to the land? So that's just kind of what I was thinking about. I want to throw it out there. I don't want to call on anybody specifically, but if someone has something immediately, Adam online, Lisa, Bobbie, Jeff, jump in there.
So our philosophy embraces the land as a gift, a place we were given for our existence forever. There is an eternal continuum, and the thinking about Nunam Watis, our land, it is the nucleus of our universe. And as a friend from Salish and Kootenai taught me, it's the cradle of our existence. And as such, as Lisa mentioned, the overlay of jurisdictions and ownership patterns and tax or non-taxed land is not a principle or is not sort of arbitrary and capricious sort of boundaries that come into the thought of care for the place that we call home. When we talk about care, it's extirpated species as well as remaining species, both flora and fauna. It is all of the forms of water, all of the minerals, all of the rocks, all of the air. It is everything that exists here. And when we take care of it, fish don't pay attention to what county they're in. Elk don't care what state boundaries are. Oregon is founded pretty much on 4 principles: anti-wolf, anti-Indian, anti-papist, and anti-slavery. And yet, when we're proud of Oregon, and we're proud of our public beaches, and we're proud of the Oregon Bottle Bill as a stewardship measure, and we're proud of our rest areas. I've lived in many states, and we're proud of our state parks. We have a lot to be proud of in public land use law. It probably needs to be revisited, but separate issue. I think that Oregon has, despite its strange precepts in founding, a lot of really good ideas about how we care for a place. We could perfect them, we can keep working on them, but I'm pretty proud to be in the room with a place where 93% of the people in this county vote. You show up. And that, when we talk about care, that's what it takes. People who show up, people who put up, put an effort and live the ethics rather than preach the ethics of taking care of the land. And I'm proud to be affiliated with those people in this county and every other county that encompasses our vast, expansive homeland.
Oh, sure.
Thank you. Agree. Everybody in here loves meetings, right? I feel like you do. I know, me too. It's our job to get involved. There are boards on every agency where they're the stewards of the land. There's planning commission boards. There are boards for volunteers for gardening and preservation and all of those things. I mean, there are ample ways to plug in, and not everybody has the time, and that's okay. But if you have the time and you have the passion, there are so many ways to be involved. Another thing that you can do is attend a meeting every once in a while. I know that not a lot of you have time to go to every meeting. That's not what I'm saying, but know when the meetings are. Come and speak your voice, because I can guarantee you your voice matters. And I think that we can get into a space where we think our voice doesn't matter, or that we're not being heard, or that we're not important. I am standing up. This is the only piece that I'll speak as a commissioner. You are important, and I do want to hear your voice. End of that section. So we want to hear from you. You are important. Also, it's an active role. Caring for the land is an active role. It's also easy to sit back and go, they shouldn't be doing that, or, well, there's, yeah, okay, but go out, get out there. Education is a huge piece. I also think being an advocate and trying to connect with people that are different than you. I was having this conversation with someone earlier. Somehow diversity is a bad word. I don't think that that's true. I think diversity is an amazing thing. Try to connect with people that you think are different than you. Share your views, share your opinions. Be respectful of people, be respectful of the land, help guide them, help educate them. Go on a walk together. I know that's scary if you don't know somebody and you think they're different, but there are so many ways to be involved and to do your part, whether you sit on a board or you attend a meeting or you're just helping a neighbor understand. There's so many ways to plug in and be part of the solution and part of the help for the land, for the West, for our county, for our area.
Could I jump in?
No, Adam,
Can I jump in? Okay, I think I'm on and you're muted.
or our obligations to care and steward for the land, how it has changed over time. That was just what I was thinking.
Okay, I didn't hear the first part of your remarks because of the Zoom. I'm gonna talk for just a minute. In the last book that I wrote, I borrowed a metaphor from Hannah Arendt, political philosopher, and it's about it thinks about the public as sitting around a table. And it was useful for me as I was thinking about the history of public lands. And as Bobbie pointed out, the history of property is the history of exclusion. And so the people that were sitting around that table early on in this history was a pretty small exclusive group. But as time went on, more and more people got to sit at that table. More and more people got to sit at that table, sharing their perspectives. And the thing about sitting around a table is if there at the center is the common thing that we're thinking about, whether that's fish, whether that's forest, whether that's fire, we can sit at our own position and see it from our perspective and with our values. We're not forced to have anyone else's perspective. And more people sitting at that table and having those conversations, you can get somewhere, maybe. I think I was born an idealist and I studied history and I became a cynic, so I'm not so sure it works anymore in my imagining. But as that table got bigger and bigger through the course of the 20th century, I saw it as more democratic, not perfect, but more democratic and ever more democratic. And some of those seats at those tables were speaking for natural values. But something happened a generation or so ago, and I think the table morphed and it was no longer round. It was no longer where I could see everyone sitting at the table, but it became long and skinny and we could only see opponents. And so to get at your question about how do we talk about this? How do we move into better relationship? I feel like we have to get more towards a round table and less towards the long skinny one. So we can see, not that we all have the same values, but so we can see each other's values. And it's been a long time, I think, since that's been a common way of thinking about how to address any problem, land or otherwise.
Thank you.
You know, when we were first meeting to talk about this, Jeff, you brought one of the things that pops up is like the tragedy of the commons, this whole myth of if the resource or land is owned by everyone, then no one will care for it. And you brought up this woman, I think it was Eleanor Ostrom, who pretty much she won a Nobel Prize for proving that that's not correct. And I was really interested to learn about her. I don't know if you wanted to share some of your thoughts on that because you're the one that brought that up, but I think it is relevant.
Yeah, sure. Eleanor Ostrom is, I think, one of the influential academics in my life. Some of you may have heard her name. She spent most of her career as a professor at University of Indiana in political theory. And I think she was awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2009, ultimately, for her work in common pool resource management and the theory behind that, and essentially debunking or shaking the foundation of understanding about the tragedy of the commons and that sort of presumption that when there's not a private owner, things all go to hell. But before I speak to her a little bit, I want to say a couple things about back to the earlier question, which was around how do we build relationship and responsibility to the land. And in my work with the Nature Conservancy, one of the things I have the privilege of doing is interacting with landowners with whom we have conservation easements. And that's an interesting realm because you have people who have come together, or organizations and people who've come together to say, all right, we agree on these big goals. This is where we want to get to. But often coming at it from very different life experiences and perspectives. And so we might have a legal right through that easement to influence how the land is managed. For example, how grazing might be managed on a piece of land. But at the end of the day, the landowner has possession of that land. They have the ability to bring cows on or cows off, and they have the possessory right. And so really an easement becomes a forever conversation with that landowner. That's what we have purchased in the cases where we've purchased an easement. And so we've tried various things to move that relationship along. And obviously when it comes to the topic of grazing, there's all sorts of different monitoring schemes and tactics you can use, and just as with any other resource. And we try on this thing, we try on that thing. At the end of the day, for me, what the bottom line is to build a system where you can have curious observers on the land. People who are curious about what's going on, who ask questions, and who are observant. And circling back around to the topic of how we can get more people involved, it comes to mind this idea of citizen science and all the various platforms we have out there now for people, anybody to plug in and add their own observations to these data sets, right? So it's, you see a bird, you see a water quality issue, you see this, you see that. You can plug into some very massive sets of data that other people are also putting observations in, and collectively, I think we can improve our quality of care for the land. So maybe I'll pause there, Kathleen. I don't know. I can go back to Eleanor Ostrom if you want me to, but
you do not have to answer any direct questions. If something else stirs you that you want to address, you can totally ignore it.
I'm
yes.
I'm gonna shut up for a minute and let these other folks get in.
I think it's interesting. In the West, we fight over water and land. We fight over rights. The fight about whose responsibility is characterized differently. And in Wallowa County, I have had difficult encounters with tourists and landowners about manure, horse manure, and where it shouldn't be, about dog feces and where it shouldn't be, about whether or not I can use one of the floats in Wallowa Lake that belongs to the Boy Scouts of America for Mother's Day lunch with my mother. There's an interesting expectation that we can tell people that we have the providential gift to tell people how to live and tell animals how to behave. And I get into this issue of stewardship in an interesting way, because I think it's great that we all want to be part of the solution. We're all trying to figure out how, what's our part. And yet I'm reminded, we are humans. We are not omnipotent. That's where this whole equation went wrong. I'm sorry. Humans, Thomas Jefferson in 1803 imagined the West as an empty canvas to be filled up. It wasn't empty, first of all. And through the removal, the Jacksonian era, all of the history of the West is an interesting study of human dominion and control. And yet, what do we really control? If we are only consumers, is that what we control most? What we consume? Because we're not really in charge. And we believe that the land hears our prayers. So you don't actually have to be on the litter patrol or be in a group or at a meeting to actually pay heed to the land and its needs. We believe the land hears our songs and feels our footsteps and appreciates our reverence. It is not quite simply having the idea of taking care of it. It is actually the idea, the ideal of living on whatever your parcel is, as if every generation that succeeds you is going to live on that same parcel and depend on it.
Mhm.
Because if that's how we take care of our yard and our wheat fields that are nitrogen depleted in my neighborhood, and the irrigated crops where we can't afford to irrigate, I think about that every day when I drive to work. What gives us the right to make that decision for 500 years from now? I am really not that important unless I just keep abusing everything. And so sometimes what we need to do is stop doing things more than we need to start doing things. And I'm often curious about where we each in our own lives, how we land on that. What is it I can stop doing? And we live in the West where everybody drives a car. And we don't have high occupancy lanes in our counties. And we have counties that don't have, towns that have no stoplights and no banks and no McDonald's. And so what is it we stop doing as well as what we start doing?
I'm thinking about that. That was wonderful. Thank you. So much going on in my head, to the point where whatever question I was going to lob, I got completely forgot it because I was too absorbed in what you were saying. I think one thing about this community, and I'm wondering, based on everybody here in this room, if you've encountered the attitude that unless your grandparents or your great grandparents were here, you're not really local, or you couldn't possibly love this area as much as that person, or you don't belong. And sometimes it's pretty overt, other times it's subtle. And I feel that, like, when I'm considering my own love of this area, I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, so it's over on the west side of the state, so I'm not local. But I think of my local, my home, as bigger than just that one town that I grew in. Like, I think of Oregon as my home, which includes Northeast Oregon. And I feel that I don't have to have had multiple generations here in order for me to share that deep, abiding love and the responsibility that I owe to place. So it's not really a question. I just wanted to throw that out there for people to think about. And I don't know, Adam, you're in, I think you're in Washington State. I don't know if you've experienced that where you're at, that sense of locality that people cling to very fiercely, but certainly in all the places that I've lived, this is one of the areas that's strongest in this is mine. I've lived here longer than you, and therefore I have more rights.
Yeah, my quick story is I was a professor at the University of Idaho for almost 20 years. Didn't encounter that sort of conversation very often when I was doing that work and where I was living. I moved to Skagit County 3 years ago, and everybody I met said, "Hi, I'm so and so, and I'm a fifth generation, or I'm a fourth generation, or I'm a sixth generation." And that seemed to be like their first name. And then they told me what their real first name was, but that always preceded it. That was not something that I always felt before. My dad has lived in the same town his whole life. He's lived essentially in two homes, uh, the home he grew up in and the home I grew up in, and that was it. And I feel like, wow, that's a really unusual thing. That's a really strong sense of place. And then I need to confess that I also grew up within the boundaries of an Indian reservation, and from that perspective, boy, he hasn't lived here very long at all. He didn't live there very long at all. So that sense of time really depends on perspective, and the sense of generation. 6 generations sounds like an awful long time in the American West, but it's just a blink of an eye for my other neighbors who have been here since time immemorial.
Notion of sense of place is interesting to me. And I am a proud Oregonian. And yet, when I think about time immemorial, as our good friend Gabe Shuships says, 500th generation citizen of the land, I think about the fact that the Columbia River is the seventh longest river in the United States, and it's 1,243 miles long, and it emanates from Canada, British Columbia, and it goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And its longest tributary is the Snake, which is 1,078 miles long. And our knowledge of the world was based on those rivers. So people, have this idea that because we live on an Indian reservation now, that's kind of that's our knowledge base. That's not. That's the reduced, diminished base of information. But like bears, we went over the mountain, and we went like salmon up the streams. And our people before modern horses, because there's an earlier horse, before modern horses hunted bison in what's now Yellowstone. And that sense of place reminds me of the native place names and the embedded knowledge in the languages, and what the stories of the land are that are told through those native place names. Because the town of Pendleton, named after a guy who never visited it, or Mount McKinley, named after a president who never went to Alaska, those names don't tell any stories. And each place on the landscape, each waterway on the landscape, each spring on the landscape has a story. And I think that that's what sense of place means to me, is the stories the land tells. And so when we talk about Poliniwas, is a place like Deborah described last night, which is, it's a name. It's here in Eastern Oregon. It means lost place, where soldiers went in there and couldn't find their way out. They were chasing Indians. Of course, that was a good thing. They couldn't find their way around. But there are places where you don't hear the crickets, or there's waterways where there are no crawdads. And there are places that are voids or vortexes or vacuums. And those places have this not only remarkable story, but as Deborah reminded us last night, they have power. And that's what I really think about sense of place. How close to the land are we for it to be able to remind us and tell us what it needs? What are we doing to regenerate soil? What do we see when we look at noxious weeds on the landscape? What we see is soil that's hospitable to those noxious weeds, not the plants that lived here before. And so I think about sense of place, and I think about stories, and I think about what our ancestors would tell us is watch what the animals do, look at what is happening to the plants, listen to what they're telling us, because as omnipotent humans, we don't actually have all the answers.
So I'd love to jump in just to sort of amplify and build on, or support, not build on, but support some of what Bobbie's saying. It makes me just, if we can pivot the conversation a little bit from legal possessory ownership to that form of ownership of whose stories are being told, whose myths, who tells myths, who tells stories. I've got a whole book bag full of books here of different stories about the West. I just grabbed a few things off my tabletop this morning, and I was a little bit surprised to see how many of them were stories about the West. Everything from the first run of the Colorado River, or the fastest run, I should say, by the Emerald Mile, to Beth Piatote's stories, to a little fun bathroom book called Don't Squat with Your Spurs On. And other things, right? But really, whose stories dominate our understanding of the West and ownership, quote unquote, ownership of the West?
I think that's the next panel.
And I can definitely appreciate this question, though it wasn't a question, but I think we all fight this in some sense. I mean, I moved here with a single mom and 4 other siblings in '89. And I can look around the room and I know when a lot of you moved here. And we moved into a house right in front of the Warnschneiders, and they probably thought, there goes our peace forever. I'm sorry, and I'm glad to still know you. But I think that, you know, there are a lot of people that say you haven't lived here long enough. And I disagree. And I don't care if you moved here a year ago, 6 months ago. If you've lived here for 5 generations, we all have a part. And I think that it means Wallowa County means something to all of us. I mean, if you've been here for 5 centuries, it's your stability, it's your history, it's your story. When I moved here, and I didn't know it because I was 9, but it was a new beginning. It was an adventure, the time to meet new people. I know people that moved here, and it's their refuge. It's their safe place. And it means something different to all of us. And I don't think it matters whether you've been here for 75 years or whether you've been here for 6 months. So glad you're here. I'm so glad you're here. And we all have a different view. I did move here in '89. I met my husband in 3rd grade. True story. We got married before graduation. And then we moved all over Oregon. I've taught on an Indian reservation outside of Klamath Falls, and we've lived in Lincoln County on the ocean. And we've been, my husband works for state parks, so that's a whole different conversation surrounding land, but we're not going to get into today. But we have been so blessed to travel around to just the most beautiful parts of Oregon, following state parks, and we're back home on purpose. And everybody's here for a different reason, and everybody thinks of their history with their lens and their life experiences, their trauma, their relationships, and it all has crafted us into the people we are today, working with the people around us. And I don't think it's a bad thing if you just moved here. I think it's a wonderful thing if you've been here for 5 generations, and I can totally respect that. I can respect that you just moved here because you absolutely love it and you've always wanted to be here, and now you can retire here and call it home. I mean, everybody has their own story, and every single story is wonderful and welcome. If anyone is new in this room, welcome to Wallowa County, and we're glad you're here. And so I just wanted to say, I don't think that your voice is heavier if you've lived here 5 generations. I think that's wonderful. It's very, very awesome for you. That's your story. But I don't think that the voice carries any more weight, in my opinion. So thank you.
What you say reminds me not only of what Deborah said last night about when someone says you don't look Indian, like you're new, and you don't look like you're rude. And so what I hear when someone says, oh, I'm a 6th or 7th or whatever generation resident, it's like, okay. And so I start to figure out the years. So does that mean you're a squatter, an encroacher, on the heels of our exile, or one of the people from the families who voted to bar Indians from Umatilla, Colville, and Nez Perce in 1901, asked the state governor to keep us out of this county.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say how many generations ago, that's what my brain starts doing. My brain does a different calculation about what that means. It's like, oh, were you here chasing us out, or you came in after we were chased out? So I think it's great to have pride in that, because you've got longevity here, which means you come from a pretty hardy family. The weather didn't kill you. We didn't kill you if you came early enough when we were still here. But it's a different calculation when you say that to me. It is perspective.
And really, I think that it's not my turn, but I'm going to go again. Okay. Thank you for that addition because I think it's super important to try to look through others' eyes. I think it's super important to try to understand and try to look at things with different views. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Deborah?
You know, I used to ask the students, they would talk a lot about the power and the importance of story. And I talk about the story, the history of the land that the University of Montana sits on is the traditional homeland, Bitterroot Silver and Ponderay. And I used to ask my students, where's your invitation? Who invited you? And they take the umbrage with that. And I'd say, well, these are things that you need to face. But one of the things that concerns me about some of the topics are like, you know, their stories. And I think Native people have been really welcoming and then been shoved aside and helped settlers settle here. But the one thing that I think is really ignored is that this land, this beauty of this land is not just a given. The Native people who have lived here since time immemorial were born, some born from the belly of the beast, came from the land itself. These people cultivated. We've cultivated this land. If you look along the coast, the salmon that Lewis and Clark could walk on the backs of the salmon, that wasn't, you know, that wasn't just natural. It wasn't a wilderness, it was tended to, and the bold decision was based on it. And so if you look at these things, the beauty of this land that you love and you tend to is on the backs of thousands of generations of people who have made this land what it is. And then I look at this extraction and displacement and what people have done to the land and what, you know, people, and then people have that false equivalence and say, look at you natives, you've got all those cars, those junk cars around your house. And I'll tell you, look at residential boarding schools and how we were told we were nothing, we didn't matter. Our religion was stupid. The way that we tended to the land was mean. We were taken from our people. We were indoctrinated into the churches, not just the Catholic Church. And then I think about that, like why some Native people vote against their own interests? Because we've been brought down to a level, like just indoctrinated year after year. And I'm going to say this, with this administration, we're all facing that. In the state of Montana and across this nation, they want to put we have to listen to the 10 Commandments again, as if that's not a firm grasp on the obvious. But you put Native kids in schools where they have to see the indoctrination of Christianity once again. So some of these things are public lands, which we own supposedly in common, our federal lands. The wealthy have their eye on that now, and the people in Congress and our own, we voted against our interest in Montana, and they're coming for Yellowstone. They fired 1,000 workers yesterday, public park workers. There's 20,000 in the nation. So you think about 20,000 and the millions of people who go to public parks. And I'm thinking, like, we need to wake up and tend to this, like, not just in a way that's like a field, but we're in trouble. And these are our watersheds, these are our aquifers, these great pieces of property, how we will be able to survive in the future. And if it goes to the wealthy, and it looks like it might, like, these are really big concerns. They're not about, I've been here for 5 generations, or I've been here for 2 generations. You have to look at yourself as I will go on for 7 generations, and I will put my family from that will go on beyond that. I mean, it's such a small thing to just feel good about a place, and it's another thing to fight for a place, to
protect
be part of it, to be part of the land itself. And I think as Native people know we come from the land, and the land tells you, wake up. So, stories are such an powerful, important thing. I'm sorry that you don't mean to dominate, but stories are so important to all of us who think. they tell us about our survival and how we can go on, but, you know, if stories are based on action, what your ancestors did, are you responsible for the stories of your ancestors? And if so, are you responsible for the actions of your ancestors? Because we base stories on action. So it's not a benign thing when you say, I'm fifth generation, I'm sixth generation. You take responsibility, or you should, for the actions of your ancestors. And, you know, responsible means you respond to it. Not that you're guilty, but you respond.
Also, I think one of the things that's kind of interesting, and certainly the Enterprise Savages / Outlaws mascot story reminds me of this as well, but our people died for this land. That's the benchmark. That was the standard. We died for this land. That is what we face again. That is where we're scarily going, because people, the water protectors at the Dakota Access Pipeline, there were people there willing to die. Fortunately, it didn't come to that. There are many moments when it came close, but that is where it feels like we're headed again. And I think that as I said to Rich last night, we used to be reminded by our elders not to, you know, the worst person amongst us children would be the one who panicked and the one who screamed, because we don't do that. With that is not an ethic that we subscribe to. Keeping our heads, organizing, making allies, and getting supplied, being prepared. That's the way we were raised. And that was the way they were raised. And that's the way our great-great-great-grandparents raised. Being prepared, being ready, being organized, doing things together, especially hard things. And I said to Rich, you know, if we all act like Chicken Little and respond to every single news cycle, we will not be able to fight. We'll be too distracted and too disorganized and too much in disarray to fight. We have to prepare for battle. And, you know, I don't know whether we're going to the mattresses or what the euphemism is, but I will say to you, that's what I am reminded every time I think about our homelands. Our men and women who volunteered before we were citizens in World War I did not have the right to vote. Being enfranchised was not the question mark in their heads. The question mark in their heads was, is some foreign power going to make what's already been disrupted much messier for us? And if that's the case, yeah, we'll go to war. My grandfather was underneath in the boiler room of a ship off the coast of France. He didn't have the right to vote, but all of his sons are combat veterans because we still fight for this land. It is the ethic that we're born with. Now we're going to be tested.
I think that point of fighting for the land, even if you're disenfranchised, relates to fighting for the land, even if you don't own or have legal
right.
title
That's
to
right.
a particular slice of paper. I feel like it's an obligation, a responsibility to care for this place, whether it's the global threat, you know, through climate change, or it's political threats that we face. It makes me feel, I appreciate being in a space like this because of all the thoughts, the different ideas that come up that will sit in my brain for a long time, but it does also kind of light a fire. And I'm asking myself, like, well, what am I not doing? Or like, was it Bobbie, you said, what should I stop doing? I want to think about those those ideas too. And in terms of my own personal responsibility, even though I do actually own property, well, no, Umpqua Bank owns the property, but I have my little slice, and I can be tempted to sit in my house and feel safe and secure because, well, I got mine. I got my house. I got my little postage stamp. Forget everybody else. It's too crazy. News cycle. I'm going to go nuts. I can't deal with all that. So I'm just going to shut down. And so I appreciate your, again, calling me back to that's not going to help. And we have to be prepared. And again, be responsible, not guilty, but responsible.
Thank you all. First of all, I kind of thought that one time I got a history lesson from Bobbie. We were talking about treaties, and she said, Bobbie came into the room, and I said, Bobbie, come on up. We're talking about treaties. And she said, you have to start with the doctrine of discovery, and then you got to go to the Marshall decisions. So in terms of this land and the concept of ownership of it, you really do have to go to the doctrine of discovery. That's number one. Number two, and you mentioned our pal Jefferson, I'm convinced now that the history we have been given is the Jeffersonian history of this country. It's the yeoman farmer with possession of the land. And you could almost trace the history of the United States as people fleeing from Europe so they can have private land. And what has happened now, it seems to me, is that the private land business has gone so far so that a lot of people can no longer afford it. So we've driven that thing right to the edge, and we in Wallowa County are especially vulnerable because we're a cool place, okay? So private ownership of land is gonna kill us right here. It's gonna make it impossible for our children to live here, our grandchildren, unless they go off and become a must volunteer or a titan. And so I think that ownership thing is at a crisis. I'll say just one more thing. I think you mentioned Robin Kemmerer, her new book, Service Ferry, two economies. One economy is competitive capitalism, which is based on scarcity and acquisition. And the other economy is the economy of the service ferry of abundance, of making a whole bunch of berries and letting everybody have berries and making a lot of pies and leaving enough berries for the birds to pick them and shit somewhere else and spread them. Anyway, I'd like to know what you folks think about the end game of private ownership is, especially right here.
Well, that's a good question. And I just want to make sure that Adam has an opportunity to respond to that.
Kind of a big ask, the end game of private property. And especially because I don't know who that was who was talking, but because you were asking about Wallowa County, I'm not probably the best person to talk about that. I don't know what the end game is. That's my short answer. I think looking at alternatives where they have existed is one interesting exercise that we can have. I got to tell you, you've sort of caught me off guard. I'm not sure that I have anything useful to say about the end game of private property. I should think bigger thoughts the next time I prepare for a panel like this. I'll let someone else take that.
Yesterday I made a stupid mistake. I didn't bring my big diesel pickup. I brought my little Honda Ridgeline, and I tried to turn around on a street that had, there was an alleyway that people had driven through, and I misjudged the snowbank that I got up against. So I got myself high centered on my front axle. And so I went over I'm in Wallowa. I'm in Joseph. I'm in Enterprise. I'm not afraid to go up and knock on a door and say, can I borrow your snow shovel? And, I'm over there shoveling and, 3 or 4 cars go by and eventually another car comes by, somebody who lives down the road, and he gets his shovel and he gets out and we're both shoveling. And we get to the point where we've got rock on one wheel, but we don't have enough rock to get out. So then a lady comes out from this house and she brings her shovel and she says, I've got some rugs that, I don't care about. You'll just put those up the front tires. There wasn't enough traction. She went back and brought her daughter and her cat litter back, and we got my truck unstuck. But in Wallowa County, I love that the people who love to be here are generally kind, generally people I'm not afraid of, I'm not afraid to be here after dark. There are other places in Eastern Oregon, other counties in Eastern Oregon, I'm afraid to be by myself there after dark. And I drove for 11 years between Sacramento and Pendleton. It's a long commute. So, especially with a horse and a dog. But I feel safe here. And yet I remind myself, I complained to Rich a couple years ago that I was here for Chief Joseph Days. And I was here for the children's parade. And usually our family is the only one who has horses with children in the children's parade because we want the kids' parade participants to know that Indian children parade too. And we have a lot in common. And I was the horses were loaded, the kids were loaded, and a woman came by as we were just finishing. We had to pick up the manure, throw it in the back of the horse trailer. And I was parked in that grassy lot right next to Cameron's house on Main Street of Joseph. And a woman came up and said, you don't have permission to park here. I've been doing this for a few years, parking on that lot. And I said, excuse me? And she said, you don't have permission to park here. You need to move. You need to leave. And I said, really? That's interesting. Who's the property owner? She said, I am. I said, interesting. Where are you from? Because no one in this county has ever treated me that way. I'm from California. I just bought it. Yeah. I'm like, oh my God, there goes the neighborhood. So, I lived in California for 11 years. So where you could sell your 3-bedroom ranch and your 1/4-acre lot and move up here and buy a mini mansion back then in the 80s. But I said, Rich, that was the first time I'd ever felt unwelcome here. And we've been coming since my grandfather and grandmother brought us here. My first parade was in Joseph at 2. And Gib Marlin, Max Wilson, Gerald Tucker. There's a whole bunch of Wallowa citizens who used to welcome my grandparents back. There are people who had places in Joseph who said, put your tent in our backyard. We can put your horses over here. I can't remember the name of the man who used to always put my mother's name on a stall at the Joseph rodeo grounds so that my mom's horse always had a place to be. We've never been unwelcome. We were exiled in 1877. Obviously, we were unwelcome then, but my grandfather, there's evidence in the Wallowa County Museum that he as a 5 or 6-year-old was fishing here in 1903. As a museum director, I know stories of people in this county who have beaded bags or beaded gloves because a tribal family came through and the housewife helped an Indian woman give birth while they were traveling through. Someone who helped with a horse that was lame and ended up with a pair of beaded gloves. There's lots of stories of neighborliness and friendship here. But the county has some change underway because not everybody is that welcoming. I'm not sure that lady from California would have got a shovel and helped me dig yesterday when I got my front axle stuck. And I'm not sure she would have gone and gotten her cat litter or her daughter to come out and help as well. But I've always felt Probably there's one time I wasn't safe out in front of the bowling alley when I was a teenager, and there was a brown, tall beer bottle fight between some Nez Perce teenagers and some local citizen teenagers. But that's probably the only time I've ever felt unsafe here. And that was a long time ago. But I agree with you, Rich, the neighborhood's changing. And when we have absentee landlords in this county that outnumber present occupied landowner properties, I think you won't like the change either.
I'm going to step in because I think it's time for a break. But no, it's a thoughtful, this idea of feeling welcome and how that ties to how you feel about a place. I think that's an important point. So we're going to take like a 5-minute bio break, and then we will do the breakouts where we'll have an opportunity to get into smaller groups with each one of us. Here we'll meet, you can separate out and talk more about what you've heard. Everybody on Zoom will go into a breakout room with Adam. But let's try for 5 minutes. I'll start hollering when we're ready to come back together, if that works for everyone. They're good? Unless Mike, you want to add anything? Okay, awesome.
Wow, that went fast.
Yeah.
So, Bobbie,
Zagging.
you know, this is my recent time, local history to national history. The time you're talking about, when I moved here in 75, Alcatraz was not far behind us.
Right.
Black power, brown power, and good citizens of Loudoun County in 1971 wanted to hunker down and be white.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Tom McCall.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
State Oregon.
It was Tom McCall. 1970s, exactly what he was talking about.
Yeah. Before all of a sudden we could have real general conversations with Indians here. It wasn't until the mid to late 80s. You know, that hung on. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, we had a county commissioner who was convinced that you were going to take over the land. Together, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, no, yeah. And you know, I used to but that's actually not the case. So we're still. You can be, don't be too proud. Sherman Alexis was fast because he had to pay for his gas. Yeah.
I just wanted to say I guess I but when I talk about here, I found really rich that we don't do the public.
talk about it at the breakout. Instead, this is an opportunity for you to respond to the conversations you've already heard, and speak with us, speak with each other, and share your ideas. And because it's a small enough group, what we thought we would do is Jeff and Bobbie would be together over on this side, and you guys can self-select to go have a conversation with Jeff and Bobbie, and Lisa and I will be on this side where you guys can come and have a conversation with us. And we will be wrapping this up at 12:45. Did I miss anything? Shannon, sound good? Okay, well, so let's do that.
All right.
Okay, fish trap looks